I whispered 4 words to a total stranger because I could not stand to fall apart in front of 300 people, and those 4 words changed my life before I even knew his name. Kiss me. I'm yours. I said it in the lounge of the Fiancé Grand Resort in Atlantic City, 9 feet from my fiancé and my own sister, laughing together like 2 people who had no idea what that laughter was about to cost them. Caleb saw me turn toward the tall stranger in the dark suit near the bar, the one nobody in that room would meet eyes with. He saw that man's hand rise slowly to my jaw, asking a silent question before he ever said a word out loud. "You mean that?" the stranger asked, quiet enough that only I could hear it. I told him I did. He kissed me, and I felt Caleb go still across the room, not with jealousy, with something closer to fear. I had no idea in that moment, standing there running on nothing but borrowed nerve and 4 sleepless hours, that I had just put my hand on the most dangerous man on the East Coast, or that in 72 hours he would be the only person standing between me and a prison record I did not deserve. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I am not the kind of woman who does things like that. I plan. I verify. I have built an entire career on being the person companies call at 2 in the morning because something has gone wrong and they need someone who will not make it worse, and composure has never been a personality trait for me so much as a professional requirement. I do not, under any circumstances, kiss strangers in hotel lounges to make a point. But 3 days before that night, I had been the happiest, almost engaged woman in Philadelphia, and by the time I reached that lounge, the version of me that never panicked had quietly run out of road, and I wasn't entirely sure I was still the same person who had packed that suitcase. Here is how it happened. My name is Avery Quinn. I'm 29, a cybersecurity consultant, and for the past 3 weeks I had been living at the Fiancé Grand Resort on a contract to secure the digital infrastructure for its biggest event of the year, a nationally televised high-stakes poker weekend with more cash moving through one building than most cities see in a month. Caleb, my fiancé of 14 months, told me he had business of his own in South Jersey that same week, which meant we could share my room, make something of it. A working trip that felt almost like a honeymoon rehearsal. What he did not mention was that my younger sister, Madeline, was already booked into a suite 2 floors below mine. I found out the way you find out anything ugly these days. A text meant for someone else, sent to the wrong thread, at 11:40 at night, 3 words long. I did not scream. I did not cry in the hallway where anyone could hear me. I put on the black dress I had packed for the closing dinner with the resort's ownership group, walked down to the lounge on legs that did not feel entirely like mine, and found them there, exactly as the text had promised, toasting champagne like it was something worth celebrating. So I found the most unreadable man in that room, a man built like a closed door, and I used him to make sure Caleb saw precisely how little I needed him left to feel wanted. The stranger's name, I would learn in the next 10 minutes, was Alessandro Vieri. When I opened my eyes after that kiss, braced for nothing more than an awkward thank you and a fast exit, he said instead, "Ms. Quinn, I think we should talk somewhere private." He knew my name. I had never told him my name. That was the exact second the night stopped being about Caleb and started being about something I did not understand yet. Something that would not fully make sense for 3 more days. 3 days that would end with a false fire alarm, a fortune in stolen poker winnings, and a man I had trusted with my entire professional reputation finally telling me who had really used my identity to try to destroy my life. Before I tell you what happened in that private elevator, hit subscribe now so you don't miss how far this goes, and like this video if you have ever had to fake composure in front of the person who broke you, because Avery is about to need every ounce of hers for what comes next. The elevator carried us up to a floor that had not appeared on any directory I'd studied during 3 weeks of mapping this building's security. His office looked less like a hotel executive suite and more like a war room. one entire wall built from screens cycling through camera feeds from sections of the property I had not known existed. Up close, in real light, he was harder to categorize than he'd been in the lounge, dressed like money but built like someone who had done physical work before he started paying other people to do it for him instead. He moved like a man who had never once had to raise his voice to be obeyed. "You run the Vieri Grand," I said, because it was the only sentence I could manage. "I own it," he said, quietly. "The name on the deed is a corporation. The name in this city, among the people who matter, is mine." I asked why a hotel owner needed a private elevator and 6 men outside his door who looked hired for something considerably more serious than valet parking. He didn't answer that directly. Instead, he told me something that turned my knees to water. For 6 weeks, someone using my own authenticated work credentials had been pulling confidential VIP arrival schedules, private security rotations, and internal service corridor maps. Exactly the information a person would need to rob the biggest poker weekend this resort had ever hosted. "And you think that person is me?" I said. "I think," he said, "that person is using you. I intend to find out which." He wanted my laptop, my phone, full access to every system I touched, effective immediately. I told him no. I would help him find the breach because my name was already attached to it, and I refused to let anyone else write the ending of my career for me. But I would keep my own equipment, my own judgment would be respected. I would not be detained or shadowed without cause, and I could walk away the moment my name was clear. A man in his position could have taken whatever he wanted from me without asking twice. Instead, he studied me for a long moment, the way you study a hand of cards you weren't expecting to be dealt, and said only, "Agreed." That was the first crack I saw in the intimidating stranger from the lounge. Not weakness, restraint. And I was already beginning to understand that restraint, in a man like this, was rarer and far more dangerous than anything standing outside his door. We spent that first night working the breach in his office, and it told me more about him than anything he actually said. He did not hover. He did not perform concern for my benefit. He pulled a chair across from mine, opened a laptop of his own, and matched me pace for pace through 6 weeks of access logs, occasionally asking a question sharp enough that I had to stop and actually think before answering. Around 2 in the morning, I told him flatly that his security architecture had 3 separate points of failure I would have flagged in the first week if anyone had asked me to look. "Nobody asked you to look," he said. "I'm asking now." I told him that wasn't how consulting worked, that you don't get free advice because you finally decided to be polite about it. Something moved behind his eyes that might, on a less controlled man, have been the beginning of a smile. "Everything is negotiable, Ms. Quinn," he said, "even politeness." I should have found that unsettling. Instead, I found myself negotiating a rate for the additional work, at 3 in the morning, with a man who, by his own admission, ran half the criminal infrastructure in this city. And somewhere in that ordinary, business-like argument over money, I stopped being afraid of him in the way I probably should have stayed afraid. Working the breach with his team confirmed the part I had been hoping wasn't true. The sessions weren't spoofed. They were mine. Real, multi-factor authentication, approved from a device fingerprint that matched my own personal laptop, not some remote rig operating out of another country. Someone had been inside my apartment. Someone had put their hands on the exact machine I used to do my job. Only one other person besides Caleb had a key to my place back in Philadelphia, and that was my sister. I sat with that fact for an entire night before I said it out loud to anyone. Madeline had used that key a dozen times over the past year, watering plants, feeding my cat, whatever a good sister does when you travel too much to keep a life running on your own. Somewhere in there, apparently, the definition of good sister had quietly changed, and I had not been paying attention. I remember sitting in that small, borrowed office at 2 in the morning, staring at my own login credentials on a screen that wasn't mine, and feeling something close to grief for a version of trust I hadn't realized I was still operating on. The assumption that the people with keys to your life would only ever use them the way you'd intended. I drove to the rental where Madeline and Caleb were staying and let myself in with the key she had given me years ago for emergencies. She was curled on the couch in one of Caleb's shirts, and for exactly 1 second, before she registered my face, she looked happier than I had seen her in years. Then the color drained out of her all at once. I did not ask about the affair. We both already knew. I asked her one question. Had she ever let Caleb touch my laptop, my devices, anything at all inside my apartment while I was traveling? She swore she hadn't, crying now, insisting that whatever existed between her and Caleb had been about finally feeling chosen for once in her life, not about hurting me on purpose. "You always win, Avery," she said, and the ugliness of that sentence sat between us for a long time, before either of us said anything else. "I don't need you to lose for me to feel like I exist," I finally told her, and I meant it, even while some petty, wounded part of me wanted to say something crueler. I needed you to not do this specific thing, with this specific man, 3 days before I needed to be able to trust every decision I made. She didn't have an answer for that. I'm not sure there was one. "You always have the career, the plan, the fiancé who looks good in photographs, and I got so tired of being the sister who almost has things." I believed the second half of what she'd told me about the devices. I did not believe the affair had been some accident of the heart that simply happened to her. Both of those things were true at the same time, and I carried both of them out of that apartment with me. Because if Madeline genuinely hadn't touched my equipment, then someone else had, and the only person who'd had repeated, unsupervised time alone in my home, while Madeline supplied exactly the kind of distraction Caleb was good at arranging, was Caleb himself. Caleb found me alone near the service elevators that same afternoon, before I had even decided what to do with what Madeline had told me. He looked terrible, unshaven, jittery in a way that 3 days of humiliating his fiancée in public should not have made him. "Avery, whatever you think happened, it's not." I cut him off and told him I didn't want an explanation. I wanted to know if he had ever touched my laptop while I was in Baltimore for the Hendricks audit. He went very still. "Why would you ask me that?" he said. And there was something underneath the question that had nothing to do with guilt over Madeline, and everything to do with a different kind of guilt entirely. A flicker I noticed and did not mention, because the version of Caleb standing in front of me still believed I only knew about the affair. I told him I hoped Madeline made him happy, turned around, and walked away before he could see that my hands were shaking, not from heartbreak this time, but from the sudden, certain knowledge that he was hiding something considerably bigger than a woman. I brought that theory back to Alessandro's team, and within a day we had enough. Login times lined up precisely with every night Caleb had claimed he was working late, matched against 6 months of his own social media check-ins 2 blocks from my building. Caleb had used my laptop. That much I could prove. But the deeper I dug, the less it actually explained. Whoever pulled these files hadn't grabbed everything available to them. They had grabbed exactly the right things. VIP arrival windows tucked inside 15-minute shift change gaps. Service corridors that existed only on internal maps, never the ones circulated to outside contractors like Caleb. Camera blind spots I hadn't even fully mapped myself 3 weeks into this job. Caleb was a luxury events consultant, charming, opportunistic, and completely incapable of knowing, on his own, which 60 seconds of a security rotation were actually worth stealing. Somebody inside the Vieri Grand's own operation had handed him a shopping list, which meant the person who could still frame me for all of it was walking these halls, quite possibly sitting in the room every single time Alessandro and I reviewed the evidence together. That person turned out to be easy to like and nearly impossible to prove, because his name was Gavin Mercer, and Gavin had spent 11 years building the exact kind of trust that makes betrayal invisible. He was Alessandro's director of surveillance operations, the man who had personally trained half the security staff, and he became my main technical partner in tracking the breach. The first time I flagged a missing block of footage from a service corridor, Gavin had an answer ready before I finished the sentence. "That's the East Wing camera bank," he said, barely glancing at the timestamp. "We had a firmware update roll through there in March. It drops recordings intermittently. We've got a ticket open with the vendor." The second time, it was a synchronization error between two systems installed in different years. The third time, a corrupted backup from the spring renovation. Each explanation, on its own, was completely believable. It was only after the fourth one that I noticed the pattern underneath the pattern. It was always Gavin explaining the gaps. Never a second source. Never raw data I was allowed to check myself, only his summaries, delivered calm and complete, the way a man talks when he has said the same reassuring sentence so many times that it no longer costs him anything to say it again. I started quietly pulling the original timestamps instead of accepting his team's prepared reports, cross-checking them against badge swipe records from doors nowhere near his cameras. Late one night, alone in the small office they'd given me, I found the first thread that didn't match his story at all. A 9-second window where a badge reader logged an entry that Gavin's footage insisted had never happened. I sat on it. Accusing Alessandro's most trusted security director, 4 days before the biggest weekend of his year, on nothing but one 9-second discrepancy, would either get me thrown out of the investigation completely or get me hurt by whoever this actually was, if it turned out I hadn't been careful enough. I tested him once, carefully, before I ever mentioned the badge discrepancy directly. In the middle of an unrelated conversation about staffing for poker weekend, I asked whether the badge system and the camera system had ever been cross-validated against each other, just as a matter of routine. He didn't hesitate. "Different vendors, different logging formats," he said. "We've talked about integrating them for 2 years. It's on next year's budget." It was a perfectly reasonable answer. It was also, I understood later, exactly the kind of answer a man gives when he has spent 11 years making sure two systems that could catch him never learned to talk to each other. I thanked him and didn't ask anything else. That night I photographed the badge logs myself, on my own phone, instead of requesting an export through his department, because I had started to understand that in this building, the difference between evidence and Gavin's version of evidence was not a technicality. It was the entire case. 2 nights before poker weekend opened, Gavin brought Alessandro a new piece of evidence, an email supposedly recovered from a device tied to me, written in language that read exactly like a conspirator laying groundwork for an alibi. He recommended pulling my credentials entirely, locking me in a guest suite under guard for the duration of the event, and running the weekend with his own internal team instead of mine. On paper, it was the responsible call, the safe call, the one nobody could later blame him for making. I had no way to disprove that email in the next 2 hours, and Alessandro had every reason in the world to protect his event over protecting a woman he had known for 4 days. Instead, he sent his men out of the room, sat down across from me at the same table where we'd argued about my rate at 3 in the morning, and asked one question. "Did you betray me?" I said no. That was it. That was everything I had, my word, and nothing behind it but 4 days of watching each other work. He looked at me for a long time, the same unhurried, complete way he'd looked at me the first night in this office, and then he told Gavin the plan was off. I kept my access. I kept my freedom. And I understood, watching him choose me over the easier, fully defensible option, that Alessandro Vieri was risking real money and his own reputation on nothing but the decision to trust me. Not because the evidence had cleared me, because it hadn't, but because he had chosen to believe me anyway, in a world where believing the wrong person could cost him everything. If you were the one holding all the power in that room, with a fortune and hundreds of guests riding on the answer, and someone you barely knew swore she hadn't betrayed you, would you have believed her, or believed the paper trail sitting right in front of you? Tell me in the comments, because Alessandro's answer was about to be tested by a great deal more than one email. That night, after Gavin left the room and the accusation had been shelved, Alessandro found me on the terrace outside his office, staring down at the boardwalk lights instead of sleeping like a reasonable person the night before the biggest event of his year. He didn't ask why I was awake. He stood beside me at the railing, close enough that I was aware of exactly how close, and for a while neither of us said anything. "You could have let Gavin win that argument," I said eventually. "It would have been easier for you." "Easier isn't the same as correct," he said. "I've built a great deal of my life on that distinction." I asked him, because I finally had the nerve to, what a man like him was even doing negotiating with a cybersecurity consultant instead of simply taking whatever he needed, the way everyone assumed men like him took everything. He was quiet long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. "Because taking things has never once made me trusted by the person I took them from," he said. "And I find lately that I would like to be trusted by you." It should have sounded like a line. It didn't. It sounded like a man admitting something that cost him more than the poker weekend riding on the next 24 hours. I turned to look at him, and for a moment the space between us narrowed to almost nothing, his hand rising the same slow, deliberate way it had that first night in the lounge. I felt the pull of it, real and unhelpful and badly timed. Then somewhere below us a car door slammed too loud, and the moment passed the way moments do when neither person is quite ready yet, and he stepped back first, which told me something too. "Get some sleep, Ms. Quinn," he said. "Tomorrow I need the version of you that sees everything." I told him that version of me didn't sleep well either, and he almost smiled, the closest I had seen him come to it, before he told me to go anyway. I did, though it took me a long time to actually close my eyes, and not entirely because of what was coming the next night. Poker weekend opened the next morning, and for almost 18 hours it went exactly the way it was supposed to. High rollers filled the private tables under lights built for television. Broadcast crews wired the main hall for the final table. Caleb and Madeline, still on property because leaving early would have looked like exactly what it was, kept a careful public distance from each other, which told me they weren't as solid a couple as they needed everyone to believe. Caleb especially looked wrong, sweating through his jacket in a climate-controlled hotel, checking his phone every few minutes, flinching every time a staff radio crackled anywhere near him. Gavin, by contrast, had never looked calmer. He walked the floor with the easy confidence of a man who already knew exactly how the night was going to end. I didn't know it yet, but he was right. I just didn't know which ending he meant. At 9:47 that night, in the middle of the televised final table, every fire alarm in the Vieri Grand went off at once. No smoke, no fire. Just 3,000 guests moving toward exits under protocols I had personally helped design 2 weeks earlier, protocols now working against me instead of for me. While uniformed security pulled staff toward crowd control in the main hall, I watched. On the one bank of monitors Gavin's team hadn't managed to route around me, a service door in the east wing swing open from the inside. 6 men I had never seen on any guest list walked straight into a restricted corridor toward the VIP cash cage, following a route that matched, almost move for move, the stolen service maps from 6 weeks earlier. Underneath the chaos on my screen, I saw it. The same half-second synchronization gap I'd flagged and then buried 3 separate times over the past week, always right before Gavin handed me a reasonable explanation for it. It had never been a glitch. It was a door Gavin opened on purpose, every single time, at exactly the moment someone needed the cameras to see nothing. I stopped asking who had used my credentials and started asking who had the authority to make physical security evidence disappear over and over for 6 weeks without anyone ever questioning it. There was only one answer, and he was standing 40 feet away from me on a floor full of panicking guests, speaking into a radio like a man managing a crisis instead of causing one. I did not touch the fire system. I did not disable a single life safety protocol because that would have put real people in real danger, and that was never going to be how I won this. Instead, I got on a radio channel Gavin's team didn't control, pulled in the 2 supervisors I had personally vetted during setup, and had them lock every service corridor badge reader that didn't belong to legitimate emergency personnel, while leaving every public exit exactly as open as it was supposed to be. I was 3 badge readers into the lockdown when the service door behind me opened. One of the 6 men had peeled off from the others and found his way into the security corridor instead of the cash cage, and for a moment we simply looked at each other. Him working out whether I was an obstacle worth the time, me working out that the door behind him locked from the inside, and I was standing directly next to the panel that controlled it. I didn't scream. I didn't wait for anyone to save me. I hit the corridor lockdown 2 readers early, sealing the door shut behind him before he'd fully registered that I'd moved. Then hit the general alarm for that specific hallway, the one that brought Alessandro's men running instead of the public fire crews already busy with 3,000 guests. He got one hand around my wrist before the second man from Alessandro's team came through the far entrance, and after that it was over fast. The kind of over that leaves your hands shaking for an hour afterward, even though nothing happened to you that would show up in a mirror. Alessandro reached me maybe 90 seconds later, and the look on his face when he saw the man being walked out in restraints, and then saw me, upright, furious, entirely unharmed, was not a look I had seen from him before. Something that had cracked open faster than his usual composure allowed, and taken visible effort to put back. "I'm fine," I told him before he could ask. "I locked him in myself." "I know," he said. "That is precisely the problem." It wasn't concern dressed up as control. It was a man realizing, in real time, exactly how much he had already come to need the answer to be different than it could have been. It took 4 minutes, the longest 4 minutes I have ever lived through, to finish sealing the rest of the corridor. The 6 men reached the VIP cash cage and found a door that no longer recognized any credential in the entire building except mine and Alessandro's. They were trapped in a service hallway with nowhere to go, and resort security, the real kind, the kind that had no idea any of this had been happening, picked them up without a single guest ever learning there had been anything to fear beyond a false alarm and an inconvenient evening. I found Alessandro in the security office 40 seconds after the last exit reader locked. Gavin was already there, already talking, already halfway through a sentence that put my name in the middle of it, in the same calm, reasonable voice he had used on me a dozen times that week. I put my tablet on the table between us instead of arguing with him out loud. 6 weeks of timestamp comparisons. Every gap Gavin had explained away, laid out next to the badge records his explanations had never quite matched. Underneath all of it, the login pattern that traced not to some hacker Alessandro would never find, but to Caleb, sitting 3 floors up in a hotel suite, sweating through a jacket, waiting to hear how this ended. "Ask him where he was standing 11 days ago at 2:17 in the morning," I said, "and then ask him why his answer won't match his own badge log." Alessandro didn't ask if I was sure. He looked at the screen for maybe 10 seconds, looked at Gavin, and told his men to bring Caleb down too. Gavin tried one more explanation, something about corrupted files and unreliable software. Alessandro didn't let him finish it. For the first time since I had walked into that lounge 4 days earlier, I watched every piece of the story Gavin and Caleb had built to bury me collapse in under a minute, because it had never been built to survive someone comparing raw evidence instead of trusting a summary. Caleb's face, when security walked him into that room, told me everything about the kind of partner he had actually been. He hadn't known Gavin was prepared to let him absorb the full weight of it the moment the cash cage door held. Their alliance came apart in real time, each of them trying to hand the other more blame, which only finished a job my timestamps had already started. Madeline heard enough of it from the hallway to understand that Caleb hadn't kept visiting her apartment purely because he loved her, that her spare key to my place had never stopped being useful to him. I watched that land on her face from across the room, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I felt no satisfaction in it at all. It just looked like exactly what it was. 2 people learning, at the same moment, exactly how little they had mattered to the men they'd trusted. Nobody was dragged out in handcuffs in front of a camera. No guest ever learned how close the biggest poker weekend of the year had come to a robbery that could have hurt someone. None of it made the 5 o'clock news, because Alessandro Vieri did not handle his enemies in a way that made headlines. What mattered to me was simpler than any of that. 3 days after being accused of the exact betrayal that turned out to be Gavin's, my record inside the Vieri Grand's own systems was cleared, in writing, with Alessandro's own signature attached to it. What happened to Gavin and Caleb after that wasn't something I witnessed, and I never asked Alessandro for the details, because some parts of that world I understood I would never be fully invited into, and some parts I didn't want to be. What I know is that Gavin never worked in private security again anywhere on the East Coast, and that Caleb's name quietly stopped appearing on the client rosters of every luxury events firm in 3 states. The kind of professional erasure that doesn't make headlines, but ends a career just as completely as one that does. Madeline moved out of the apartment she and Caleb had been sharing before poker weekend had even fully ended, without waiting to find out whether he would still want her once the version of him that had impressed her turned out to be mostly performance. He offered me a job after that, head of cybersecurity for every property he touched, more money than I had made in the last 5 years combined. Permanent access to the kind of resources most consultants spend an entire career chasing. I said no. Not because I didn't want him, and not because I doubted by then exactly what kind of man he was underneath the danger. I said no because 3 days after watching Caleb choose my sister, moving straight from that wreckage into a job that tied my whole life to another powerful man felt less like healing and more like the same mistake dressed up in a nicer building. Alessandro didn't argue. He didn't send flowers to change my mind, or have someone quietly follow me home to keep me safe, or call every other night the way men like him could easily arrange without anyone ever telling him no. He let me go completely, the same way he'd let me keep my own laptop on the very first night we met. Madeline came by before I left Atlantic City and handed back my spare key without me asking for it. I told her the truth, that I might forgive her someday, but I did not trust her today, and those were 2 different things that did not have to happen on the same schedule. She didn't argue with that either. We hugged for exactly as long as it felt honest, and no longer than that. If you've made it this far with me, you care what happens to Avery as much as I did writing this down for you. So hit subscribe if this is the kind of story you want more of, and tell me in the comments whether you think Avery made the right call turning down Alessandro's offer. Because 5 weeks later, alone in my apartment in Philadelphia, slowly rebuilding my client list 1 contract at a time, I was not entirely sure I had made the right call either. Then one message arrived, from a number I had never given him. It only asked whether I would be willing to see him again. I chose the place myself, the same lounge, the same corner table at the Vieri Grand where all of this had started, and when I walked in, he was already sitting there, like he'd been prepared to wait as long as it took. He stood when he saw me. He didn't reach for me. He waited, the way he had waited for an answer that first night, before he ever touched my jaw. "You look well," he said. "I am," I said, and meant it in a way I hadn't been sure I would 5 weeks earlier. He gestured for me to sit, and for a few minutes we talked about nothing that mattered. My new clients, whether the East Wing cameras had finally been replaced, small, ordinary things that felt strange and steady after everything that had happened in this same room. Then he asked, carefully, why I had agreed to come. I told him I had spent 5 weeks asking myself that same question every night, and the honest answer was that turning down his job offer had been about not wanting to need him. Showing up here was about finding out whether I wanted him anyway, which turned out to be a very different question. I told him the truth about the first time I'd said those words to him. I had been humiliated. I had wanted Caleb to watch me be wanted by someone else, and I had barely known the man whose jaw I had grabbed to make that happen. This time was different, and not because the danger was gone. Alessandro Vieri was never going to be a safe, ordinary choice, and I had stopped pretending otherwise somewhere in the middle of those 4 days. It was different because I had watched him choose not to control me, over and over, every single time the easier option was sitting right in front of him. He had asked before he ever kissed me. He had negotiated instead of taking my equipment. He had trusted my word over hard evidence when trusting the evidence would have been simpler for everyone. He had let me walk away completely, with no strings attached, when keeping me close would have cost him absolutely nothing. So I said it again, on purpose this time, with nobody left to perform for and nothing left to prove. "Kiss me. I'm yours." He asked if I was certain. I didn't answer him with words. I closed the distance myself, and this time, when he kissed me, it wasn't a woman running from a life that had just fallen apart. It was a woman who had rebuilt her own name from nothing, choosing, with her eyes wide open, exactly who she wanted to hand it to.